This video is part of the Microsoft Virtual Academy. Welcome to the System Center Configuration Manager 2012 Deployment and Infrastructure Technical Overview. In this session, we are going to cover the deployment and configuration of the Configuration Manager 2012 infrastructure from three main perspectives: simplification, infrastructure, and administration. When we talked about Configuration Manager 2012 from an engineering commitment perspective, we had to make some promises to our commitments. The first was around the infrastructure. We had to begin with modernizing our infrastructure and modernizing the architecture that supports that infrastructure to ensure that we were actually improving the way things were done, the efficiency they were using, and the reductions we could achieve in things like bandwidth or administrative involvement. This is broken down into a few main areas. The first is around minimizing infrastructure for remote locations. We've had more and more feedback and data from organizations that tell us they don't want to place infrastructure in locations across large WAN or small WAN links or placing hardware in remote locations. So providing an ability to reduce, remove, or consolidate that infrastructure and utilize other technologies, for example branch cache, was a main goal for us. Part of this included the consolidation of infrastructure for primary sites. And when we talk about comparing Config Manager 2012 to Config Manager 07, this is mainly focused on providing an ability for an organization to flatten their hierarchy or simplify or consolidate their infrastructure and their site roles. Part of modernizing architecture is also improving scalability and improving data latency for the organization. We have now a central administration site role that sits at the very top that is simply there for administration and reporting. Other work, like policy distribution, package replication, etc., is distributed to the primaries as much as possible based on how your organization may be set up. Things like file processing still occur once at primary site, and then replication is used to reach other sites. So there's no more reprocessing at each site in the hierarchy, reducing bandwidth and cycles at the server locations. System-generated data, hardware inventory example, and status can be configured to flow to the central administration site hierarchy directly, as opposed to in the past how they would flow through and trickle upstream. An additional promise we made for the infrastructure was also to be trustworthy. This means that interactions with SQL DBAs are consistent with Config Manager 07, and improving our relationships to SQL services is going to improve the ways we distribute, replicate, schedule, troubleshoot, and maintain the data replication around the network. So we thought we'd talk about this from a few different examples. And here is a consistent example where we are using different types of hierarchy definitions. We have one central site, we have three primaries, and then off of each primary we have some secondaries that even have tiered primaries below them, as well as distribution points connected to those. When we think about this from a Config Manager 2012 perspective, what we're trying to achieve is a view that's much more like this. One CAS, two primaries, and then a secondary hanging off each of those with its own distribution point. And when you think about the ways this could be achieved, there's a lot of stuff that has to happen under the hood to be able to simplify an architecture model from what we just saw to this view. So the question that's very popularly asked is, well, when would I need a primary site? And when we think about when we want a primary site, there are about 4 or 5 main reasons that a primary site would be defined as needed in an organization. The first is scale. Even though with Config Manager 2012 we moved to more than 100,000 clients per site for primary site, we still have organizations going north of that, and they may need multiple primary sites to that effect. We want to maybe have some disaster recovery implementations for reducing the impact of primary site failure. We may have requirements for local points of administration for different locations geopolitically, and that also feeds the political reasons or geopolitical boundaries that sometimes organizations find themselves in. And then also content regulation, content management, content replication are ways, primarily focused around content that we could see the need for primary sites. Things that have gone away: decentralized admin, data segmentation, client settings, language, and then content routing across deep multi-tiered hierarchies are all ways in the past we had multi-tiered primary sites, but we now have an ability to centralize those, and we've checked off each of those with new feature and capability to allow organizations to flatten their organization's hierarchy for some very basic reasons. So when would you need a secondary site? So we just talked about primary sites. What about secondary sites? Because they're still a major part of the infrastructure's requirements. Managing upward flowing WAN traffic, or tiering content routing for deep network topologies, or you don't have any local administration, are three kind of primary things that we would see requirements for a distribution point to be placed at, or a secondary site to be placed at a location. When would you need a local distribution point to go with that? Well, when we talk about things like background intelligent transfer service, that may not be enough in some cases to be efficient across the WAN. So a distribution point location on the other side of the WAN could assist in managing or reducing the network traffic. If you were doing remote operating system deployment and you wanted to do multicasting, multicasting is not something that you'd want to send across the WAN, so a local DP would do that. And then similar, another service that is delivered across the wire to each individual node will be application virtualization streaming, which is something we do off of our distribution point. But if you're going to do that locally, which is only one of the two ways that V can be delivered, the other is download execute. But for streaming, you'd want to put a local DP. So when don't I need a local DP? Well, BITS provides enough control for WAN traffic. So if BITS as a client service, we build on top of the Windows BITS technology in the network stack. If BITS is helping enough across the WAN, a local DP would not be employed or recommended. And the second one that's very important to consider is something called branch cache. If branch cache is deployed with distribution points running on server await R2, or clients running compatible OSs, Vista SP2 and above with a KB and Windows 7, branch cache can significantly reduce, in either its hosted or distributed models, the network traffic incurred with our client-server relationships. So let's talk about distribution points for a moment. We've now referred in Config Manager 2012 to what's called one distribution point type. In the past, this was a collection of server roles in the hierarchy in Config Manager 07. It is now one distribution point type. The distribution point type can be deployed on both client and server. It can be deployed on Windows Vista Client SP2 and later, including Windows 7. And on the server side, we can deploy to Windows Server 2003 Service Pack 2 and later, including Server await and Server await R2. This distribution point has the ability to configure throttling and scheduling. You can see on the right side we actually have a scheduling tab that allows us to say what are peak and non-peak times of the day and when do we want to allow replication to be used or received or delivered from and to a distribution point. We can specify drives for content storage. We use the IIS feature. It's required on the DP. This assists us with things like our software catalog. And we can coexist on secondary site servers or being remotely connected to them to assist in architecture. Content pre-staging. Content pre-staging is consistently something we have improved since Config Manager 07. We had something called a courier sender, which allows for pre-staging at a site server, all content type. That was introduced in Config Manager 07. We now have something called the package preload on site, which allows for pre-staging at a site server for classic packages, like think about like your toolkit stuff. We can do things like manual pre-staging, where we can manually copy packages to a branch DP point, basically a push. And we can also export content. This allows us for the pre-staging of content on a DP, which was introduced in the first versions of Config Manager 2012 Beta 1. New in Config Manager 2012, so building on top of the Config Manager 07 stuff, is a feature that can preload on a site server or a DP all package types, content library, package shares. We register package availability with that site server so we know about it and it's now available and can be referenced through the MP and the client as a source of location. The pre-staged content is still compressed, so we're going to benefit from that kind of optimization. And it's a single action to load multiple pre-staged content files. And there's a command line we run for pre-staging that content file to that location. That basically does the uncompression for us. We also have an ability to provide conflict detection to ensure the latest package versions are at those distribution points. This becomes very commonly a challenge in organizations that are managing package versioning, in addition to going through repackaging of applications as they get patched and updated. So we also want to talk about minimizing the infrastructure supporting those remote office locations. And so we're going to talk about this in a few ways. Here is an example called the Woodgrove Bank, and this is their company profile. And you can see here we've got an interest in doing remote office optimization. So we have a Chicago Metro office where we have one administrator with other IT responsibilities, limited day-to-day use, so that person is busy but doing other things. We have roughly 50,000 clients, and we run weekly inventory and deploy software and software updates to that location. As we go through what's called remote office optimization, the corporate campus, which is a primary site of 48,000 clients, has a local SQL server, has server roles like management point, distribution point, 5 of those, fallback service point, service location point, software update point, etc., are all there. The sales offices only have 15 clients, good connectivity, and also have employed branch cache. A district office is a secondary site in this example. 1,500 clients, managed up and down WAN traffic. They've got SQL Express running out there, and the server roles they have are an MP, so management point, distribution point, software update point, and a PMP. We've also got a processing center where there's a distribution point with throttling and scheduling for 485 clients. So a smaller location, very focused on a certain role of organization. And we manage downward flow of content over the WAN to that location. Then finally, we have a London primary site, 50,000 clients, inventory class reporting at the collection level, and administrative segmentation for the servers, handled with a different group. So as we talk about forest and boundary process flow, let's just talk about how the forest and boundaries are processed with things like discovery for an organization. So you can see here we have engineering.contoso.com. Their discovery runs on Contoso in North America. Engineering is a domain in Hawaii, and they have some different subnets there. And as you think about the boundaries, they've got a North American boundary, a Hawaiian boundary, and then they have actually 3 IP-based boundaries. And you can see the different boundary groups that are defined there. And then in the bottom table on the right, the boundary group purpose is site assignment with content, or some of the smaller locations like Chicago's 10x and 11x, or the St. Louis 12x site are purely just for content distribution. So what's new in Config Manager 2012 for forest discovery, something that is a very important part of a Config Manager deployment? The first is that we are discovering site forests and trusted forests. Sorry if you had a visual pop there. We can manually add forests that are not trusted, so we can do some federation. We can also include forests for a perimeter network if we're doing internet-based, and we support both publishing and discovery in those examples. Discovery for us returns the following information. We receive domain information, IP subnet information, as well as the AD site information from those locations. And we support now something called boundary creation. This can be automatic or manually done either at initial installation or migration, or later on as network topology evolves. Boundaries. So a little bit about boundaries. We have retained the same boundary types as Config Manager 07. So the ones you're used to seeing, like Active Directory site, IP address range, IPv4 subnet, and IPv6 prefixes, have been there, but we've also simplified the management of boundaries in Config Manager 2012. We can create boundaries as part of forest discovery during install. We can enable Active Directory forest discovery and simply let the product do the work for us. We can also separate client assignment and content lookup, so we can allow site assignment to be done with one boundary definition and content lookup done with another. We've added something called boundary groups to keep boundaries organized in logical containers that are easily managed, administered, and controlled. And the boundary groups are the primary object for client assignment and content lookup, not the boundary. So we're simplifying the process for how a boundary and a client relate to each other when they do things like content search and content lookup. We automatically create a boundary group and associated boundaries from 07 sites during migration. So if an organization is moving from Config Manager 07, they've probably at this point already achieved a fairly robust search and configuration of their boundaries. We can consider that a migration base for us. So with the new server role in Config Manager 2012 called the Central Administration Site, or the CAS, a common question people get asked is, when do they need a CAS? Well, a couple of main reasons. One is there is more than one primary site in a single hierarchy. You would want to have a CAS above that. And secondly, if you wanted to offload reporting and administration from a primary site into a more administrative-focused environment or central group. One migration consideration to make is the CAS must always be installed on new hardware. This is a new server role for Config Manager 2012. So continuing on discussion of delivering the promises, we also want to talk about minimizing infrastructure to support unique settings and policies. Going back to our Woodgrove example, Woodgrove is now growing, their company profile's changed, and we want to assist them in minimizing their infrastructure. We have a headquarter in Chicago, we have a subsidiary in London. In Chicago, we have 2 to 4 administrators with other IT responsibilities, and they're limited in their day-to-day use of our product. We have 125,000 clients in that location, and again, there is weekly inventory, and we deploy software and software updates to that location and the 125,000 client list. The Chicago campus has 75,000 clients. The London office has 49,500 with 500 servers. So the breakdown would be the following. Chicago would have the CAS. There'd be no clients to that MOX, to that CAS site role. Administration and reporting for hierarchy would be there as well as administrative segment for HR clients. So we'd have a separate location there for HR. Chicago would have 2 primary sites, primary 1, primary 2. Primary site 1 would be 25,000 clients, have local SQL, have an HR collection-based settings and remote control enabled. Primary site 2 would be similar but a little bigger in site for clients, local SQL, and an engineering collection-based settings for power control. The London primary site, 50,000 clients and an inventory class reporting at the collection level and an administrative segment for servers as one example. So one of the big investments we've made in Config 2012 is increased investments with SQL Server. And one of the things we wanted to ensure is that we were increasing our trustworthiness by becoming more dependent, more reliant on the SQL technology that's known to be an industry leader in content replication, content management. And one of the things we had to do was ensure that our interactions with SQL were consistent with Config Manager 07. So at the very least, we had to do what we were already doing a great job at. But where we could improve, we wanted to take advantage of the new elements of SQL. Configuration Manager administrators can monitor and troubleshoot new replication approaches independently of the SQL environment. So we wanted to make sure that Configuration Manager was utilizing a lot of the SQL operations and bubbling those up in the console as reports and alerts wherever possible. One of the recommendations is 1 Config Manager site per SQL Server instance. That's a requirement for us. All database communications are encrypted, so we have a security level there, increasing our trustworthiness. And TCP/IP ports for service brokering are clearly defined and worked with on the security groups. So an important thing to talk about, in addition to talking about distribution points, site hierarchies, and SQL, is replication. We have different types of data that gets replicated: global data, site data, and just content. Global data is created by administrators, site data is created by the system, and then content is a subset of all of that, things like software packages, installation source, software images, software updates, boot images. And this table kind of clarifies some examples and the type of replication that is used for that type of content or that type of data. You can see here things like global data, which are the infrastructure bits like collection rules, package metadata, software update metadata, the back-end information, that's all based in SQL. The data is found in the CAS and all primary sites and secondary sites. For the site data, the stuff that's created by the system, these are collection members, hardware inventory, alerts, console alerts, etc. Again, that still lives in SQL and lives in the CAS and the originating primary site. In the content, like I mentioned, is our software package source, the updates, the images, that's all file-based. So still consistent with 07 there, and is kept at the primary site, secondary site, and DPs. Note there that is not kept on the CAS. Okay, so let's talk about SQL replicated data types. Global data examples would be things like collection rules, package data, program metadata, deployments, configuration item metadata. You can think about anything at that level that is an example of global data applications, etc. And then site data examples could be collection membership results. You can see here it's not just the metadata but the actual results. Alert messages, hardware and software inventory, metering, asset intelligence, and CAL tracking, client access license tracking data. Status messages of clients, software distribution status details, status summary data, component and site status summarizers, client health, data and history, wake on land information, and quarantine client restriction history from NAP would be site-specific or site data examples. So here's a conceptual model of how a CAS could be set up with some global data, and then we'll talk about how the different types of data flow through. So we have a CAS in Texas based in a city called Keller. Then we have sites in Amarillo, Canyon, and Hereford. And we also have a site over in Germany in Baumholder. The global data will be available at the CAS, as well as all primary sites. So collection rules, package metadata, deployments, and security scopes would all be kept beginning with Texas and Keller. And then we'd have global data subsets of that out in Amarillo, Canyon, and Hereford. And package metadata and status would be located there, as well as program metadata. Site data would be available at the CAS, replicating to the primary sites like inventory, status, and collection membership results. And that would move up from Germany to the CAS in Keller, as well as from Amarillo up to Keller. Content. Content is things like software packages, software updates, operating system images. This would flow downstream from the CAS through the primaries to the secondaries. And so this would be available where content has been distributed to a DP and would flow downstream. So client settings is also a major important part of our infrastructure improvements. It's the easiest step to infrastructure reduction is to stop using primary sites for different client settings. This is one of the most common reasons why organizations would have multi-tiered primary sites would be to simply achieve different client agent settings for their hardware software inventory, etc. The main reason for that is because in Config Manager 07, client agent settings, hardware inventory polling, for example, was set at the site level. So by moving that to a different level of filtering, for example at the collection level, we can reduce the need for multi-tiered primary sites. Client settings and collection assignment. So collections are global data. In Config Manager 07, a collection created at a primary site could only affect resources at or downstream from that site. In 12, collections are now globally evaluated at all sites because there may be replication or relationships that are defined across different locations for that collection membership role. Clients from any site can be members and receive targeted deployments from any other collection that they have a relationship to. That could be upstream or downstream. Change focuses from site-centric administration to client-centric administration to ensure that better efficiencies are gained through this new collection relationship model. And don't forget, global data, collection rules and counts, and site data is collection membership. Hardware inventory, very simplified. Forget about the def mofs, browsing WMI namespaces to select the classes you need. We're now backward compatible. We can import those MOF files, but hardware inventory has significantly improved overall from 07 to Config Manager 2012. We use client settings to configure inventory class. And you can see the defaults are computer system, memory, proc, profile. And then building on that, server settings, services, the NT event logs are all part of this. On the laptops, for example, battery, PCM-site controllers are all major parts of that hardware inventory information that flows up in content. So a major way we've achieved this is something called role-based administration. And one of the biggest ways we can simplify the flattening of a hierarchy is to provide a security model in console that allows organizations to say that a certain user has a certain business role and they can only see what's relevant to them to do their job. So role-based administration allows the mapping of what we call organizational roles of administrators to security roles. We apply security templates to those security roles, so as a user is created as a relationship between one of those roles, they begin to see a filtered console example of what they can do. This is a hierarchy-wide security management from one single console. This is global data, so we don't have to worry about local sites and tiering of primaries and secondaries, but we're simply removing the console clutter and only showing what's relevant to that user. So administrative segmentation is broken down into a few key terms. Security roles. These are used to define the scope of control. So what types of objects can I see and what can I do to them? So for example, as we've written here, the Software Update Manager role gives rights to read and deploy collections and software updates for different types of locations in the organization. In addition to security role, we have something called security scope. So which instances of classes can I see and interact with? So we know the role and we know the locations, but what about what we can do against them? So object class instant rights. And then finally collections. What resources can I interact with? And that could be geopolitical, that could be functional. Collections are defined in many different ways by organizations. But the administrative segmentation is based on these three primary terms: security role, security scope, and collection. So to give you an example, we've got a scenario here. Meg is wishing to distribute a package to all of her EMEA users in the West region. She's a central administrator. She can create and distribute packages. And we have a France and an England primary site. Over in France, we have Louise, who is a French administrator who manages the French collections and creates advertisements for the French collections. And then in the UK, we have Anthony, who is an English administrator. That's his role defined, and he has English collections and create advertisements for English collections. So Meg can actually see those and control that flow down to them. In 12, when we do RBA, Meg wishes to do that same activity, and just building this out. Meg can create and distribute applications to the CAS, and then that will flow. And as we build out, Louis can see the French collections and create deployments for the French collection from that same CAS. And also, Anthony can do the same thing, but only for the English collection locations. Collection limiting. So Meg gives Louis permissions to the French systems, and you can see the cascading effect, all systems down into French systems, down to French desktops. Louis can read the French systems, and all collections limited to the French systems relationship rules, but Louis cannot see all the systems and English systems because they're not part of his scope of control. Louis has full control to modify and delete French desktops, so he has been locally empowered to create and remove systems from collection relationships. And Louis can create new collections that are limited to French desktops or French systems in order for Louis to do his job locally in France. Collection limiting. So every collection is limited by another. And you think about a downstream and upstream relationship here. Assigning a collection to an administrator automatically assigns all limited collections. Ship with 2 read-only root collections. That's out of the box when you do the install. All systems and all user and user groups. We do provide the templates though for RBA, and we'll show you those in a minute. So I'm here in my server console, and you can see I'm in my new administrative console for Config Manager 07. And there's a couple of things I want to show you here. If I expand my security and permissions navigation under the administrative node, you can see I have something called administrative users, security roles, security scopes, certificates, and accounts. These are all linked from the home page inside the console, and I can also just browse them on the left side. So you can see here I have 3 administrative users defined. I have an administrator that I am right now currently on the console as. I have Patrick Patch, who is a software update manager. I have Randy Remote, who is a remote tools operator, and they have specific security roles that they are members of. Talking about security roles, here is the list of default security roles that you get out of the box with Config Manager 2012. These 13 roles are provided inside the installation, and these were directly based on feedback from our early adoption customers about how they wanted to define their administrative roles and scope of control within their organizations. Within each of these, we can simply right-click, and we can look at the properties to show you the object class and instant rights. By going to the Permissions tab, You can see on this property page, we have abilities to expand out and view the different rights and object class instant rights we have against certain areas of the product. For example, I've just expanded the application experience here, and I have a yes because I'm administrator on this template I'm viewing properties of. I have abilities to approve, create, delete, modify, etc. Everything for applications, for collections, it's all a yes in this case. If I jump down to the remote tools operator role and go to the properties again, if I go to the permissions here, you'll see it's very different. I have a very limited list of permissions allowed for me, basically on collections, and I have a yes for all of those, but that's it. I couldn't see the other elements of object classes I could control. You can also create custom security roles. By importing or creating your own, you can define other boundaries like geopolitical or collections of roles, because there may be organizations that have administrators in some locations that are using multiple collections of different types of daily administrative roles. So how does this translate into a user experience? So if I'm just going to minimize my console here, and I'm going to launch my console in a different context. So I'm going to run as a different user, and I'm going to launch my console as Patrick. And don't forget Patrick was Patrick Patch. This is a software updates administrator role. And as this console launches in Patrick's context, you'll see a slightly different example. If I go to my software library, you can see I can only view the software updates. Applications and operating systems are not available to me. In the monitoring navigation, I can still see quite a bit of navigation there because of my needs to view client status, view site hierarchy, view reporting. And under assets and compliance, well, as this remote tools operator, I'll be deploying against different types of collections. I can see those all listed there. Well, let's try a different console, and I'll just try a different login here. And I'll log in as Randy. And Randy is a remote tools operator. Randy will have a different console experience again, and this time you'll see a different navigation that's even more minimized. Right away, you can see on the left side, we don't have all the navigation experiences available to us. All that Randy can see is the monitoring and assets and compliance navigation. And so under monitoring, even there's a subset. We can only see some of the abilities for him to see status on the elements of his role. But then he also has to see that across the different collections. So he still has a complete view of assets and compliance where all the collections are listed. So that's just two examples of how we can limit the view. And I also showed you how we can actually customize, define, and view the different rights that those different roles can have. Okay. So as we deliver on the promise from Config Manager 2007 to 2012, there's some other elements we wanted to ensure we were focusing heavily on. As we've talked about scalability and data latency improvements in 2007, we had a central primary processing all data from all child sites. This was heavy on the network, heavy on the servers, and there was a lot of redundant processing happening that could be removed. So now we have in 2012 a central administration site, the CAS, where no data processing happens. Another promise we've made is consolidating infrastructure for primary sites. In Config Manager 07, we had separate or tiered primary sites for different types of capabilities. And in Config Manager 2012, we now have abilities to define things at a collection level, as well as provide new security capabilities like role-based administration and admin segmentation to allow organizations to flatten their hierarchies. And then a final promise we were talking about today was minimizing infrastructure for remote offices. In Config Manager 07, that was delivered through secondary sites, branch DPs, or standard distribution points. In Config Manager 2012, that is now secondary site recommendations or distribution points with throttling and scheduling, or the full distribution point, or even just using branch cache. And so as you think about our migration from Config Manager 07 to Config Manager 2012, you can see some significant things in the right column of this table that we have achieved in order to deliver on some of these promises. So let's talk a little bit about migration. There were 5 main areas that we want to talk about here when we talk about the migration of Config Manager 07 environments to Config Manager 2012. The first is assisting with the migration of objects. Also, assisting with the migration of clients. We don't want to throttle the network while we do this. and we want to reuse 64-bit hardware wherever possible. Through all of this, we want to flatten the hierarchy. So to do this, we have a built-in migration capability in Config Manager 2012, and we have some migration types of jobs we can achieve or deliver through the installation. The first is object migration, and this would be things like migrating collections, packages, boundaries, rules, as well as collection-based migration. So we can be selecting a specific collection and migrate the associated objects of that collection in a very explicitly controlled and targeted fashion. We also have content functionality, so the reuse of existing Config Manager 07 content, and we achieve this through something called distribution point sharing, allows Config Manager 07 distribution points to behave and interact in a Config Manager 2012 environment while still managing Config Manager 07 clients. We also, thirdly, support the importing of Config Manager 07 inventory MOV files to assist organizations in getting their history and their inventory pulled across to the 12 environment. The system requirements, based on components, we have site servers and site roles. We have the database level of componentry. We have distribution point level, as well as client. And then on the right side, you can see a heavy parallel to the Windows supported platform roadmap. You can see basically all of these supported platforms from Windows are listed, but we do have variations between the components of what operating systems can run for certain services. So assisting in preparing for Config Manager 2012, we're providing some advice and some early thinking now as organizations think about their Config Manager 2012 deployments, especially from the perspectives of what they have in Config Manager 07 today. Here are some key tips. First, where possible, try and flatten the hierarchy. This will be made possible with new functionality in Config Manager 2012, but where possible in 07, start to think about what could change and what kind of primary, secondary, or tiered primary sites could be consolidated, and what collections could become potentially even redefined. We would recommend that the considerations of Windows Server 08, 08R2, and SP1, as well as SQL 08, cumulative update 10 or above, as well as 64-bit architecture, are considered. These are requirements for us, and the earlier these can be adopted or planned for acquisition, the smoother the deployments will be. We would highly recommend the implementation of branch cache. This was introduced as a supported capability in Config Manager 07 SP2. Branch cache significantly reduces the network utilization by providing a shared cache experience between the end nodes, which Config Manager supports. Moving from web reporting to SQL reporting services, if this is something you've not investigated today, we would recommend the investigation of this today. To assist in the delivery of SQL reporting services moving forward, the earlier this knowledge can be gained, the better. Considering today, no matter what environment you're running, the segmentation of devices and users in your collections, and so thinking about collection relationships and getting much more explicit about who is a member of what collection will carry forward very well for Config Manager 2012. And then finally, getting away from drive letter mappings in things like package locations, moving towards more of a UNC path will carry a very good investment moving forward to 2012. So that's it. Thank you for joining us today on this session around the infrastructure and deployment and migration of Config Manager 2012. This has been delivered to you by the Microsoft Virtual Academy.